being able to simplify details that we see in our photo or in front of us if we're drawing on location or from life is a really important skill to develop. It's a really important tool in our drawing toolbox that we can pick up to use when we need to. And I thought this scene that's actually a zoomed in shot from up on the cliff outside of Edinburgh was a great example to use because there's simply too much detail in it to draw. And that's particularly the case with panoramic shots. So how do we make the choices? What do we do? What's involved in simplifying? What are we looking for to draw with what we do draw? And how do we decide what to leave out? So in this particular scene, simplification is going to be an important part of creating the effect of the distance. There is a great depth of plane from the closest object, say that person down in the front, to the farthest object, say the church spire that we can see silhouetted against the sea, which is behind the buildings on the horizon line. And so getting a sense of distance moving back that looks real in my drawing will depend a lot on, I think, simplifying what we see. And that's because in life, things that are closer we see more easily in more detail, and things that are further away we see less detail. The problem is the camera lens captures all this detail, which can then feel overwhelming when we draw, because if we look even just above that closest building, there's a lot of detail that we can see with the rooftops immediately above that. And then we have a row of trees, treetops, and then we have clearly a street behind where the front of the buildings, of the facades of the street, are in shade, but we can see the rooftops very well and more chimneys. And then we have a lot of streets that we can see fairly tightly foreshortened. And so we really just see row after row after row of chimney and of roof line and of the play of the colour. And as the chimneys, in a sense, move higher up the scene, they become smaller because they become further away, and we're seeing more of them in the same space than we see, say, closer down the bottom. And so the question is, how do I draw this? And then, of course, there's another row of trees, and then buildings are even further away. So how do I simplify what I'm seeing? Partly how we simplify things is by working out what we don't simplify, and that's what I'm doing at the moment. I'm not simplifying this closest object, this closest building, because this is where I draw the detail. This is where I establish detail so that when I look at this scene and I see the detail, my brain has something to work on in terms of what am I looking at in the rest of the drawing. Oh, I'm looking at more of this. And so by establishing the detail in one spot, I'm now making it possible for my brain to have something to use to extrapolate from, to go beyond when it looks at the detail higher up where I don't actually draw it. So knowing what not to simplify and to choose to spend more time drawing it is important. Now I'm using at this point a 0.3 millimeter pen, and when I finish this building, I think it's when I finish this building, I switch to a 0.2. If not, I think I do. I think the buildings above and those trees above, I use a 0.2 millimeter pen. Now, I'm doing the closest foliage here with my 0.3. Now, obviously with trees, we're not drawing every leaf, so we have to simplify when we draw trees, unless they've got very large leaves and we're very close and it's a very detailed drawing. But when I do the next band of foliage, higher up, roughly across the middle, slightly above the middle of our drawing, I want to draw less detail there to reflect the fact that it's further away. And then there is a third band of foliage higher up. And again, I want to draw less detail there. And there is actually even a bit of foliage higher up again, and I want to draw less detail. I want to simplify more. So it's not just the buildings we're simplifying, it's everything that we have in our scene. The question is, what lines, what marks do I want to make to capture the simplification? What do I still want to draw when I'm simplifying? And the answer is, I want to draw the effect of what I'm seeing in as many or few lines and marks as possible. And so a really helpful way is to look at what we want to simplify and say, what is the most obvious thing we see? What is it in this section of the drawing that stands out? And if we look at what I'm drawing now, I'm still using the 0.3mm pen here. What stands out are the chimneys. And what stands out are the horizontal lines of the roof, where the pitch of the roof joins. And those lines join up in what is approximately a horizontal line interrupted by the chimneys. So it's this pattern, this effect of horizontal lines being the tops of the roofs and being broken by chimneys and then the chimney pots. That's the effect I want to capture. I don't need to draw it exactly as it is in this scene, because even in these closest roof lines and closest chimneys, there's really too much detail, and some of it we can't even see particularly clearly enough to know exactly what's going on in these closest parts, let alone the furthest parts. So we have to ask, what's the visually the things that stand out? Because that's what we want to make sure we capture, and then we can link those things in more subtle ways with lighter lines and so forth. So I'm adding a bit of hatching for shadow, and value is one of the ways we simplify as well. We don't need to put all the lights and darks that we see in our scene, in our reference, and we don't need to do them as strongly as we perhaps can perceive them in our reference. We need to ask, what's going to work best at the end in my drawing? These are all choices we get to make. But generally, I'm not simplifying the values as much closer as I will be simplifying the values further back. So now I have switched to a 0.2mm pen. So I have a lighter line. That's going to help me firstly draw a bit more detail where I am drawing the detail. It will let me put more into a smaller space without it being overwhelmed with a sense of inkiness, which could easily happen if I use a thicker pen. I decided to add just a little bit of value on each side of the chimney, which comes out a little bit and therefore catches a little bit more light, so that the chimney came out more, just to give a slightly three-dimensional sense to that wall. So now I'm doing the trees further back, and as you can see, I'm doing less detail. I'm simplifying them compared to what I've done closer. But the real challenge is going to be in the section above, where if we look at this section above, we can start thinking, well, what do we see? Well, what we see is this wedge shape of street facade in shade. So I certainly want to draw that, but in a more simplified way. If I look really hard, I can see suggestions of windows and so forth. So I want to have a suggestion of windows in that shaded facade, but I'm not going to be particularly worried about drawing what's there. I'm just going to do some notional windows because it's just the effect. I really don't want the windows to stand out too much. I just want to sense that there is architecturally something on the front of this shaded area. So the important thing is to get this sense of horizontal lines, although here they're not so horizontal, they're forming an upward moving line, being broken by chimneys. And as we move further back, the chimneys become smaller and smaller. And one of the things I do, I can't tell looking at this right at this minute if I've already done it, is I draw a bit of a dotted line across the top of this, if you like, band of detail, the top of this mid-section of rooftops that we see, just below another horizontal band of trees. And that reminds me of how the distance that I need to spread the transition of my simplification to further greater simplification as I move upwards, where it stops. Because what I want to do is to have a fairly smooth move from larger to smaller, from not very complex to even less complex. And at the very top of this section, I really want a silhouette of the chimney tops because they stand out against the darker trees. So here I am now doing some lines. I made the trees section that I've just dotted out too high. It shouldn't be quite that high. Makes the trees look too big, which makes them feel closer than they really are. That's why scale is so important. We need to be consistent with our scale throughout the whole drawing, or we start to make some parts look larger or smaller than they really are. And that may not always be so obvious in our finished drawing, although sometimes it just may not read quite right. It may stop, in this case, our scene going backwards as far as quickly as it really does. So you can see I've established that silhouette edge. And now I need to join the wedge shape between the shaded facade and that point. And so I'm really just scattering chimneys around here, little triangular shapes for the chimneys, and some chimney pots on some of them. And then just a few horizontal or angled lines to represent the tops of the roof lines. But I'm not trying to particularly follow any exact detail. And I do it lighter and less of these chimneys and roof lines the higher up I go. And when I do them, I do them closer together because the foreshortening keeps happening. The visual compression happens more and more the further away we go. And so there are more details compressed into smaller areas. And I can reflect that by doing my lines, the horizontal lines I do closer together. So now I have this larger modern building that sits at the distance, just below the very furthest things. And it's a nice contrast to the architecture. But again, look how much I've simplified it. Because if I start to draw too much detail, it's going to feel closer than the buildings that are below it that really are closer. And it's not as easy to judge the scale from the actual form, from the actual shape of this, because it's got windows, but in fact they're very oversized windows compared to the windows of the buildings lower down. So I've used a 0.1 for this upper section, and just look how much less there is of the furthest parts. I've really just gone to draw the silhouette edge and just a few marks to represent just a little of the detail that we have. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Learning to simplify, an incredibly helpful skill, and I think a necessary skill for creating all sorts of effects, as well as the practicalities of drawing some incredibly detailed scenes. I hope this has been a helpful demo. Why not give it a go? This photo is on my channel community page if you'd like to try it out yourself. But whatever you draw, however you draw it, whether you simplify what's in front of you or not, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next video. Bye.